The crystal caught the candlelight and threw it back like sparks from a cold fire. My father stood at the head of the oak table, chin lifted, glass raised, pride blooming red across his cheeks. Silver gleamed, china chimed, and the house smelled of rosemary and butter, as if tenderness could be baked into the roast. Heather sat straight-backed beside him, hand resting lightly on Brian's sleeve, the diamond on her finger, winking like it knew a secret. When my father cleared his throat, the room settled into that practiced hush, the one I knew better than my own laugh. And then he said it soft, almost playful, like a joke you're supposed to laugh at to prove you belong. Some kids make you proud. Others just take up space. Forks paused in midair. Eleanor smiled the way she does in church. Controlled, gracious, unmovable. Heather didn't smile. She let the words land, then turned her head just enough to look at me across the candles, a look that wasn't triumph so much as confirmation. Brian stared at his water glass, tracing the rim with one finger, as if he'd found a note only he could hear. Somewhere in the house, the furnace clicked on a small animal waking in the walls. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever sat at a table where your name was said without being spoken, hit the like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. To understand how that toast became a knife, you have to know the shape of the room I grew up in, and how quietly it taught me to be small. I was the child who colored the margins when the assignment said, "Write on the lines." Paint under my fingernails, thrifted sketchbooks stacked under my bed like a private library. Our house in West Hartford was sensible and symmetrical, a colonial whose windows watched the cul-de-sac like polite eyes. Thomas liked numbers because they behaved. Eleanor liked proofs because they led someplace certain. Heather flourished like a greenhouse plant, fed, pruned, measured, applauded. I learned to grow in shade. When I was 14, my painting of a girl standing under a streetlight, just a wash of midnight blue, cut by a single yellow beam, won first in a statewide show. The letter from the Capitol looked official enough to take a place on our mantle. My art teacher called the house and left a message that said, "Scholarships Portfolio Future." That night, my father slid the letter back into its envelope with 2 fingers, the way you touch a bill that isn't yours. "Nice," he said. "Did you finish your algebra review?" Heather had a debate tournament that weekend. We ate cake for that. Eleanor was not unkind. That's the thing people get wrong when you tell this kind of story. She remembered birthdays, corrected grammar, gently brought tea when colds dug in. But kindness and regard are not the same, and the difference leaves a draft you never quite get warm from. When Heather needed quiet to study for AP exams, Thomas spent a Saturday building a desk with perfect lamp height and soft, close drawers. When I asked for a corner in the basement to hang canvas and a clamp light from the joist, he smiled in a way meant to be patient. "Hobbies are wonderful, Dana," he said. "Finish college, then we'll talk about studios." I learned to be proud without witnesses. I learned to take praise from strangers and fold it into something that could fit in my pocket. College was my first clean breath. A state university with brick halls and long hallways that smelled of turpentine and coffee. Professor Larson told me my brushwork was decisive, a word that felt like a door I was allowed to open. I called home with small victories, and the line always seemed to have a second conversation running on it: honors lists, internships. Heather's path rising in a straight, well-lit line. "That's nice, dear," Eleanor would say, and then almost kindly, "Have you considered a minor in business, just so you have options?" I took the minor. I earned the A. I laughed at the joke. When Heather made junior partner, the text from my mother was a trimmed hedge of words dinner. Saturday 6. Heather's promotion. Wear something nice. It wasn't an invitation so much as a calendar block. I picked a black dress with sleeves to the wrist, simple earrings, a soft red lip. Rain hung in the air but didn't fall. The porch light glowed when I arrived, the same amber circle that had followed me in from childhood practices, officer meetings, school plays, where I painted backdrops behind other girls' faces. The house was as I remembered, and exactly the same dark wood white trim, a runner straight down the center of the stairs like a spine. In the living room, Heather sat like she belonged on the catalog page, ankles crossed. Brian angled toward her as if his chair had leaned of its own accord. When I said hello, he blinked as if from far off, then nodded. "Great to see you, Dana." He hesitated, catching the second syllable at the last moment. "Great to see you, Dana, not Donna, not Day." Heather's diamond winked, a well-trained eye knowing its light. I tried to start small. "The gallery sold 3 pieces last week," I said to Thomas as he came in from his study, the scent of leather and printer ink trailing him. He kissed my cheek as if the motion were prescribed by some manual. "That's nice," he said. "Bar's by the window if you'd like a drink." If. He didn't look to see if I poured one. Dinner moved the way these dinners always move plates, heavy conversation heavier in the one direction it knows. Caseloads, courtrooms, billable hours. At one point, Brian started to mention a show he'd seen downtown. Something about mixed media, a large canvas with torn paper that looked like wind. But Eleanor redirected him gently, like guiding a distracted child back to his worksheet. "Speaking of downtown," she said to Heather, "did you get an appointment to see that condo we liked? The corner unit?" I counted the breaths between my sentences and decided not to spend them. When the cake came in, "Congratulations" scrolled in chocolate like a legal signature. The knife glinted. The candles burned without pooling. Thomas stood glass in hand, and the old house seemed to gather itself into the moment. I reminded myself to sit straight. I reminded myself to keep my face where they would not see anything I would have to explain later. To our brilliant daughter, he began, looking at Heather and everyone at once. "Discipline, dedication, drive." He spoke the words like they came in a set, a matched trio in a gift box. He reminisced about report cards and trophies, about mornings she woke early to run through note cards, as if success were a hymn we could all hum along to. Eleanor dabbed the corner of her eye and smiled a smile that forgave the tear. Brian looked properly proud. The silver candlesticks watched like sentries. And then Thomas let his voice drop into that friendly register men use when they're about to say something mean and call it a joke. "You know," he said with a chuckle, "he did not fully commit to some kids make you proud. Others just take up space. If shame makes heat, the room should have warmed." But what I felt was distance, the kind that has its own air. The candlesticks flickered. The chandelier ticked as the bulbs cooled. My heartbeat slowed in a way that felt like choosing. Heather turned, not to comfort, not to soften, just to check the aim. Eleanor lifted her glass because that's what you do when a toast ends. "Vivian, dear." Aunt Vivian touched the stem of her glass without raising it and stared down at the linen mouth set in the almost smile of a woman who has made peace with 100 small indignities and suddenly cannot find the peace tonight. I could have laughed. I could have cried. That's the exercise you do in therapy list, the choices you had, and the child you were when you learned to take the smallest one. Instead, I took a breath that reached the bottom of my lungs and felt the room answer. "Good thing I have my own place," I said, and my voice surprised me with how unshaken it sounded. 55 miles from here." I didn't raise my glass. I set my napkin down. "From now on, the rent, the utilities, the insurance, those are your problems." I didn't say whose. I didn't need to. Thomas blinked, as if I'd spoken a language he almost understood. "What are you talking about, Dana?" The question had an old shape to it, the shape men give questions when they mean, "Don't make this difficult." "I'm talking about leaving a room where I was never really invited," I said. My hands were steady. The fork lay parallel to the knife. The candles pulled a seam of light across the polished wood. "Don't be dramatic," Eleanor said, smiling with her teeth, the way she smiles for school photos. "Your father was expressing pride in your sister. It's her night." There was a please in her voice, but it was for the evening, not for me. Heather rolled her eyes in a gesture I knew from a dozen childhood mirrors. "This is why no one takes you seriously, Dana. Everything is a scene." She leaned into Brian's shoulder like the line needed punctuation. Vivian looked up, then eyes full of something that wasn't pity. Quiet anger, perhaps? Quiet hunger for fairness. "Thomas," she said, careful and soft. That was unkind. He flicked his hand, dismissing a fly that wasn't there. "Oh, for heaven's sake. It was a joke. Dana knows we love her. Sensitive, that's all." The word fit the way a too small shoe fits. You can force your foot in, you can even walk, but not long, and not without cost. I stood. The chair legs made a sound against the hardwood, not loud, but final. 28 years, I said, and the number felt like truth you could touch. 28 years of proving I deserve a chair at this table. I looked at the cake. I looked at my sister's hand on her glass. I looked at my mother's careful posture, and my father's eyebrows drawn together as if by habit. I won't do it anymore. Silence has seasons. This was winter, the kind that smooths the edges and makes every sound carry. Outside, a car passed on the wet street tires, whispering. Somewhere, the grandfather clock found its voice and marked the hour on a bell shaped like a thimble. "This is exactly the kind of behavior we expect," Thomas said at last, as if I were a forecast he'd been right about. Tantrums. He liked that word. He'd used it when I cried at 9, over a ruined watercolor at 16, over a dress I paid for myself at 20, over a drawing a professor called necessary. He never called Heather's tears anything but stress. "It's not a tantrum," I said. "It's a boundary." The word felt gentle and heavy at the same time. I should have said it years ago. Eleanor's voice softened the way you soften when you're coaxing a casserole to brown a little more. "Let's not do this tonight, sweetheart. It's Heather's celebration. We can talk about your feelings another time." "It's always another time," I said without heat. I turned to my sister. "Congratulations, Heather. Truly." She held my gaze just long enough to make sure I saw the smile. I picked up my purse. I slid my chair back to the table like a guest who refuses to leave a scar. Nobody stood. Nobody reached for my arm. The house didn't beg. Old houses rarely do. In the foyer, I paused to take my coat from the hook. The porch light spilled a small circle onto the steps right against the dark yard. My keys were cool in my palm, the metal smelling faintly of pennies and rain. I could see my reflection in the hall mirror, lipstick, still neat hair, pinned, eyes clear in a way I hadn't seen since I was a kid in paint-smeared jeans who believed paper could hold the whole sky. Behind me, the dining room murmured, then settled. Heather's laugh rose and fell as if it had been waiting for the door to close. The house breathed. I opened the door and stepped out into air that tasted like rain that hadn't decided yet. On the driveway, I hesitated not because I doubted the step, but because every step has a cost, and even the right ones ask to be counted. The porch light hummed softly warm against the early spring chill. In the kitchen window, the chandelier glowed a galaxy of polite stars. I unlocked my car, and the dome light came on, gentle, domestic, unjudging. My phone buzzed in my purse, a text I didn't read. I put the key in the ignition and didn't turn it yet. Across the lawn, the maple held last year's leaves like secrets it hadn't decided to drop. My breath fogged the glass, then cleared. The driveway stretched toward the street like a road you could take and never come back from if you needed to. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and listened to the furnace cycle down the house, quieting the way houses do when they've already chosen their story. I could leave. I could stay 5 more minutes and explain. I could apologize for the temperature of my voice, the angle of my words, the way my hands didn't shake. The rain finally decided. A soft patter on the windshield like a hand on a shoulder. I turned the key. The rain followed me most of the drive, soft and steady, as if it knew I needed the sound. Every few miles, the wipers swept the windshield clean and gave me another clear look at the empty road ahead. The headlights stretched thin across the wet asphalt, painting a silver path towards something that finally felt like mine. By the time I reached my apartment, the air smelled of damp brick and old rain. I parked by the faded mural that covered the side of the building, a row of hands passing a paintbrush from one to another. I'd always liked that mural. It reminded me that even when people stop seeing you, you can still create something that lasts. Inside the hall, lights hummed softly. My shoes squeaked against the old wooden floor, a sound too familiar to startle anyone awake. I opened my door, turned on the lamp, and stood for a moment in the quiet. The apartment looked different that night. The exposed beams, the tall windows, the mismatched furniture. It all felt steadier than I did. I kicked off my heels and dropped my purse on the couch, the last bit of that dinner clinging to me like smoke. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. The lights from the art district glimmered below, reflecting off the wet pavement. I could still hear my father's voice, that easy confidence in every word, and Heather's laugh cutting through the moment like glass. For years, I'd tried to shrink myself small enough to fit their idea of who I should be. And tonight, for the first time, I hadn't. The phone buzzed against the table, 5 messages, all from my mother. I didn't open them. The words would be the same as always, excuses dressed as explanations. Instead, I scrolled to Zoe's number and pressed call. She picked up on the first ring. "Hey," she said, her voice warm and a little sleepy. "You home I am." My throat tightened on the next breath. It happened again. There was a pause, then a quiet sigh. "What did he say this time?" I told her. The toast, the smirk, the silence that followed. She didn't interrupt. She never did. When I finished, I could almost hear her shaking her head. "You finally said something, didn't you?" I did. "Good," she said simply. "I'm proud of you." I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that until it was said. My chest loosened, and for the first time that night, I could breathe. We talked for nearly an hour. Zoe listened while I tried to untangle the mix of relief and guilt sitting heavy in my stomach. She reminded me of all the times I'd come home in tears after family gatherings, promising to speak up and never quite managing it. "You didn't start a fight," she said. "You ended a pattern." When we hung up, the apartment was quiet again. I curled up on the couch, the city lights flickering through the blinds, and felt the ache of something ending. It wasn't peace yet, but it was space. The next morning came with a gray sky and the faint hum of traffic outside. I called the gallery where I worked and told Elaine I wouldn't be in. She didn't ask why. She just said, "Take care of yourself, sweetheart, the way a friend does when she's already guessed the truth." I made coffee and opened my sketchbook. The first lines came shaky, uncertain. Then the movement found rhythm, and before long, I was sketching what I'd felt the night before: the table, the candlelight, the curve of my father's raised glass. I drew the faint reflection of myself in the window behind him, blurred and half erased. When I set the pencil down, the page looked like something breaking open. By late afternoon, I knew what I had to do. Boundaries aren't real until you name them. So I sat at the small kitchen table laptop, open fingers hovering above the keys. The email began like a letter I'd been writing in my head since childhood. I kept it simple. I told them I loved them, but that I couldn't keep showing up to be compared, dismissed, or pitied. That I was done trying to earn a place that should have been mine all along. I didn't ask them to understand. I just told them what would change. No more gatherings where my worth was the punchline. No more help with hidden strings. No more silence pretending to be peace. When I finished, I read it twice, breathing through the tremor in my hands. Then I hit send. The sound of the whoosh from my outbox felt final. I expected regret to come flooding in, but it didn't. Only quiet. That night, I made dinner for one, lit a candle, and played soft music from the old record player I'd found at a flea market. The flicker of the flame moved across the paintings on my walls, each one a small piece of myself I'd refused to give away. The messages came fast, first from Heather, then my mother. Heather called me selfish. My mother called me dramatic. My father said nothing. I blocked Heather, created a folder for their emails, and filed them away where they couldn't touch me. Days passed. The world didn't end. Work at the gallery steadied me. Elaine noticed the shift before I said a word. "Something's different about you," she said one morning, handing me a cup of coffee. "You look lighter." Maybe I finally stopped caring something I said, and she smiled like she knew exactly what I meant. A week later, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in months. Aunt Vivian. I almost didn't answer, afraid she'd try to talk me back into the family fold. But her voice was calm, familiar, like the smell of tea and rain. "Dana." She said, "I've been thinking about you since that dinner." We talked for 2 hours. She told me things I'd never known: how Eleanor had always been the golden child in their own family, how praise had been currency, and comparison the language they learned to speak. "She doesn't know how to value what she doesn't understand," Vivian said softly. "And she never understood art or you. But that's her limitation, not yours." The words landed like a door unlocking somewhere deep inside me. "I used to think if I worked harder she'd see me," I said. "She might," Vivian replied. "But by then you won't need her to." When we hung up, I felt something shift. The problem had never been my art, or my choices, or the quiet way I lived. It was the scale my parents used to measure worth, and I'd been trying to fit into it for too long. Over the next few weeks, I started making small changes that felt like big ones. I turned my phone off after work. I spent weekends painting instead of driving home for dinners that left me hollow. I met Zoe for walks by the river where we talked about everything except family. Each choice was a stitch closing an old wound. One night, as I cleaned my brushes, I realized how still the apartment felt. Not empty still. The kind of stillness that lets you hear yourself think. I poured another glass of wine and opened the window. The air smelled of rain again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. When I looked at the canvas drying by the wall, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The colors were warmer browns, gold's soft edges of green. Not the gray and blue tones I used when I painted sadness. This was different. It looked like the beginning of something. The phone buzzed again that night. My mother leaving a voicemail that started with, "Your father and I have always supported you," and ended with, "Call us back when you're ready to be reasonable." I didn't save it. I didn't delete it either. I just let it sit there, a reminder of what used to hold me. By the time a month passed, I'd stopped expecting an apology. What came instead was understanding from people who had no obligation to give it. Elaine invited me to show one of my pieces in a local showcase. Professor Larson emailed to say he'd recommended my work to a regional curator. And Zoe showed up with a bottle of wine, grinning. "You're finally getting seen," she said. Maybe I told her, but this time, I'm seeing myself first. She raised her glass. "To that," she said. The next morning, I woke early. The city was just stirring delivery trucks idling a single gull, crying near the river. I stood by the window, watching the sky lighten behind the old factories. For years, I'd looked to that horizon and wondered when life would start to feel like mine. Now it did. But peace, I learned, doesn't mean silence. It means strength that doesn't need to shout. And as I brewed coffee, the scent filling the room, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Just done. The message came later that week, an email from my mother saying they'd like to talk things out. I read it twice, my heart steady. Then I closed my laptop and reached for my sketchbook instead. Some conversations could wait until I decided they were worth having. Outside, the light shifted across the floor, touching the corner of the newest canvas, the one that would later become my first gallery piece. I dipped the brush into gold paint and drew the first line. It felt like breathing. That night, as the city quieted and the last train passed in the distance, I thought about the girl who had driven away from her parents' house with shaking hands. She wouldn't have believed how calm the world could feel, how wide the air could be when you stopped begging for permission to exist. I didn't know what came next, whether they'd ever see what I'd built, or if they'd keep pretending it didn't matter. But for the first time, the uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt like a blank canvas waiting for color. And as the lights of the city blinked in the distance, I set the brush down and whispered to no one in particular. Let them keep their table. I have my own space now. The sound of rain began again, light, and even as if the world were painting with me. A few weeks after I sent that final email, I began to notice how quiet my life had become. Not the kind of silence that aches, but the kind that lets you hear your own thoughts without interference. Mornings began the same way, coffee steaming beside the window, a pale sun crawling over the rooftops, and the smell of paint somewhere in the room. The gallery was busier that spring. Elaine had taken on 2 new artists, and the back room filled with canvases waiting to be hung or shipped. I liked the rhythm of it, the soft clatter of frames, the muted hum of conversation as customers moved between displays. It felt honest. No one expected me to perform or prove anything. They just wanted to see the work and maybe feel something in it. Zoe visited often, usually with a paper cup of coffee and some new story about her coworkers. We'd sit on the front steps after closing talking until the streetlights came on. She had a way of grounding me without trying. One night, as we watched a couple of college students take pictures outside the gallery, she said, "You know, you've been different lately." "Different how?" "Lighter," she said. "Like someone finally took a stone off your chest." I smiled, but didn't answer. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was the first time in my life I wasn't carrying everyone else's expectations. That sense of calm lasted about 3 weeks until the knock came. It was late afternoon, and I was halfway through priming a new canvas when I heard it. Sharp, deliberate. Through the peephole, I saw my mother. She looked smaller somehow, the way people do when they've run out of control, but still pretend they haven't. When I opened the door, she didn't step in right away. She just looked at me, taking in the brick walls, the paint-splattered floor, the smell of turpentine. "So this is where you live," she said. Her tone wasn't cruel, but it carried that faint trace of disapproval she'd never learned to hide. "Yes," I said. "Would you like to come in?" She hesitated, then nodded. I made tea because it gave my hands something to do. When I came back, she was standing in front of one of my larger pieces, a layered canvas in shades of rust and deep green. "You made this?" she asked. I did. She studied it for a moment, her eyes narrowing, not in judgment but curiosity. "It's powerful," she said quietly. It was the closest thing to a compliment she had ever given me. For a moment, I thought maybe that was why she'd come, to see, to understand, even a little. But then she turned and said, "Your father isn't well. The doctor says it's just a warning sign, but still, he's been under a lot of stress." The air shifted. I knew what was coming before she said it. He worries about you, about the distance between us. Maybe if you'd reach out, it would help him rest easier. It was an old trick concern disguised as guilt. I took a slow sip of tea before answering. I'm sorry he's not well, I said, but his stress isn't something I can fix. Her eyes flashed with surprise, then softened into something like confusion. You've changed, she said. I had to. We sat for a long time after that, the only sound the clink of her spoon against the cup. She glanced again at the painting. You look happy here, she said. I am. She nodded, though I wasn't sure she understood. When she stood to leave, she said, Your father's birthday is next month. Heather and Brian will be there. I think it would mean a lot if you came. I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us, steady and deliberate. Finally, I said, I'll think about it. On the landing, she paused and turned back. Families don't just stop speaking to each other, Dana. You don't walk away because you're hurt. I'm not walking away, I said softly. I'm just not walking back into the same place. When the door closed behind her, I stood for a long time in the quiet. My hands were steady, my heartbeat calm. The tea had gone cold, but I let it sit there as proof that I could face her without falling apart. That night, I couldn't sleep. The conversation looped through my mind, not with anger, but clarity. For the first time, I saw my parents not as the unmovable figures of my childhood, but as people flawed, frightened, repeating what they knew. It didn't excuse anything, but it helped me breathe easier. The next morning, I walked to the river. The path was muddy from last night's rain, and the trees along the bank were just beginning to turn green. I found an empty bench, sat down, and watched the current move under the bridge. The water was low, clear enough to see the stones beneath. Some stayed still, others shifted slightly with the current. I thought about how I'd spent most of my life trying to be the kind of daughter my parents could understand. I'd mistaken compliance for love, silence for peace. But boundaries, I was learning, weren't walls. They were bridges built on truth. That afternoon, I called Aunt Vivian. She sounded relieved to hear my voice. I've been wanting to check on you, she said. How are you holding up? Better, I told her. Mom came by. She made a sound halfway between a sigh and a laugh. Of course she did. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Vivian told me more about the patterns that ran through our family, how my mother had spent her own life trying to earn love from people who couldn't give it freely. She's still fighting the same battle, Vivian said. You just decided to stop. Something in me softened. I don't hate her, I said. I know you don't, Vivian replied. That's why you'll heal faster than she ever did. When I hung up, I sat for a while staring at my phone, feeling the weight of those words settle inside me. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was understanding, and that was a start. The days that followed were quieter again. My art took on new energy. I began a series I called Boundaries Layers of Color, separated by fine lines of gold leaf. Each piece felt like an affirmation, a visual reminder that space can be sacred. One evening, Elaine called me into her office at the gallery. She smiled that careful smile she used when she had good news. A regional curator saw your work at the showcase, she said. They're planning an exhibition on emerging artists and want to include you. I froze, unsure what to say. Are you sure? They were certain, she said. They want 3 pieces. Opening nights next month. The words sank in slowly. For years, I'd chased the smallest signs of approval from my parents, and now strangers saw value where they never had. It felt both surreal and grounding. That night, Zoe came over with takeout and a bottle of wine. We ate on the floor, laughing about how unglamorous success looks when you're living it. "You have to invite them," she said after a while. "Invite who?" "Your parents." I shook my head. "Why would I do that?" "Because it's not about them," she said. "It's about you being strong enough to stand in your truth." Her words stayed with me long after she left. The next morning, I wrote a simple email. No emotion, no apology, just an invitation. The date, the time, the address. I told them they'd be welcome if they wanted to come. I didn't expect a reply, and for several days, none came. Then one evening, as I was cleaning brushes, an email arrived from my mother. "We'll check our calendars," it said. Nothing more. I laughed softly to myself and turned back to my work. Their absence, I decided, wouldn't make the night any less meaningful. In the weeks leading up to the show, I lived between excitement and disbelief. Elaine helped with logistics. Zoe brought food when I forgot to eat. And even Professor Larson stopped by with a note of congratulations written in his precise hand. "You've found your voice," he said. "Guard it." On the night of the exhibition, the city glowed. The gallery was bright, filled with people and low conversation. I wore a simple black dress and a calm I hadn't felt in years. My 3 pieces hung together on one wall: boundaries, inheritance, and reclamation. Seeing them there, framed and lit, felt like a quiet victory. As guests drifted by, asking questions and offering kind words, I thought about how far I'd come from that dinner table, the one where my name had been a shadow. Here, I wasn't invisible. I was seen, understood, and valued for the work of my own hands. Halfway through the evening, I caught a familiar figure near the entrance. My father stood just inside the doorway, looking uncertain in his dark suit. The noise of the crowd dimmed around me. I walked toward him slowly, heart steady but alive. "Dad," I said when I reached him. He nodded, glancing at the paintings. "Your mother couldn't come," he said. "Board meeting at the school." I smiled faintly. "I'm glad you did." He looked back at the largest piece, the one layered with rust and gold. "I don't understand art," he said after a moment. "But this, it has something." For a man who measured life in numbers, it was the closest thing to poetry. "Thank you," I said. We stood there quietly, 2 people trying to bridge decades of distance without the language for it. When the gallery owner stopped by to introduce him to a collector, my father straightened his tie and nodded proudly the way he used to when Heather won something. But this time, he was looking at me. Later, as he prepared to leave, he turned to me and said, "You look like you belong here." I watched him go, the words echoing long after he disappeared through the crowd. They weren't an apology, but they were something. When the doors finally closed and the lights dimmed, I stood in front of my work one last time. For the first time in my life, I didn't wish my family had seen me. They had, and I had survived the seeing. Outside, the night was cool and still. The reflection of the gallery windows shimmered on the river below, the colors blurring together like memory and hope. I took a deep breath, letting the sound of distant traffic fade into the hum of possibility. Tomorrow would come with its own questions about forgiveness, about what kind of relationship might still be possible. But for now, the only thing I felt was peace, as soft and steady as the light across the water. The week after the exhibition felt almost unreal. The buzz of conversation, the lights reflecting off my work, the simple pride in standing under my own name, it all stayed with me. When I closed my eyes at night, I could still hear my father's voice, low and hesitant, saying, "You look like you belong here." It wasn't an apology, but it was more than I ever expected. Work filled my days. I painted with a focus I hadn't known before, moving between canvases while sunlight pooled across the studio floor. The scent of linseed oil and turpentine clung to everything, even my skin. The quiet hum of the city below reminded me that life was moving forward, and so was I. Then, one Sunday afternoon, as I was stretching a new canvas, my phone rang. The name on the screen stopped me. My mother. I considered letting it ring, but something told me to answer. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice steady. She sounded tired, her usual briskness softened. "Dana, I'd like to stop by for a visit, if you have time." The old part of me, the one that still looked for meaning in every tone, wanted to ask why, but I'd learned to stop chasing reasons. "All right," I said. "Tomorrow at noon." When she arrived, she looked smaller than I remembered. Her coat hung loose, her hair swept back without care. I poured her tea, same as before. The ritual steadied me. She walked slowly around the studio, taking in the walls lined with finished and half-finished pieces. "You've done well," she said. The words were measured, as if she wasn't used to saying them. "I've been working hard," I said. She nodded, eyes drifting toward a photograph on my bookshelf. Me, Zoe, and Elaine at the opening night. "Your father's health is better," she said after a moment. "He's been trying to eat healthier." "I'm glad." Her gaze lingered on a painting I'd finished the week before, a woman standing before an open window, her back to the viewer light spilling over her shoulders. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "What's it called?" "Resilience," I told her. Something flickered in her expression. She took a sip of tea, then set the cup down carefully. "We were wrong to make you feel small," she said suddenly. "That night at dinner, your father, he shouldn't have said that." I didn't move. The apology, if that's what it was, felt both heavy and fragile. "Thank you," I said quietly. She exhaled, folding her hands. "But you have to understand, it's hard for us sometimes. We don't see the world the way you do. You and your art, it's not what we grew up with." "I know," I said, "and I stopped expecting you to." Her eyes searched mine, maybe for resentment, maybe for forgiveness. "Heather's wedding is in August," she said finally. "She asked me to invite you." There it was, the inevitable pivot. I felt the air tighten between us. "I appreciate the invitation," I said, "but I'm not sure I'll be attending." Her shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, the old Eleanor returned, the woman who valued composure above honesty. "You can't stay away forever, Dana. Family doesn't work that way." I looked at her, the woman who had taught me to hold my tongue, and said softly, "Maybe family works best when everyone is allowed to be themselves." We sat in silence. Outside, the rain began a quiet tapping against the glass. She glanced around again, and for a fleeting second, I saw pride cross her face. But it vanished as quickly as it came. She stood smoothing her coat. "Your father will be pleased I stopped by," she said. "Tell him I hope he's well." At the door, she paused. "You've built something good here," she said. "Don't lose yourself in it." When she was gone, the apartment felt still again. The kind of stillness that isn't lonely, just earned. That night, I called Zoe. She listened as I told her every word. "You handled it perfectly," she said. "You didn't let her pull you back." "I thought I'd feel lighter," I admitted. "But it just feels final." "Final can be freedom," she said. Sometimes peace sounds like silence. I smiled into the phone. Maybe so. Over the next few months, life unfolded quietly. My work at the gallery slowed as I began taking commissions. Elaine insisted I keep 1 day a week with them, just to stay grounded, she said. Professor Larson stopped by occasionally, dropping off books or old art journals. I found myself surrounded by people who gave without asking for anything in return. Then summer came, bringing long evenings and warm light that lasted late into the studio hours. One morning, I received a letter from Aunt Vivian. She'd written it by hand, her cursive neat and steady. Your mother told me she visited it read. Don't let the guilt creep back in. You've done what our family never managed, broken a cycle. That's no small thing. I kept that letter pinned near my easel. As August approached, invitations to Heather's wedding appeared in friends' mailboxes. I knew because Zoe showed me hers with an awkward smile. I didn't realize she had my address, she said. She probably found it through Mom, I said, more amused than hurt. Zoe hesitated. Do you think you'll go? I don't know, I said. Part of me feels like it's not my place anymore. She nodded. Whatever you choose, make sure it's your choice, not a reaction to them. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear. I woke early, made coffee, and stood by the window watching the sunlight pour into the room. For once, I felt no pull toward that old house, no tug of guilt or longing. I wrote a short note of congratulations and sent a small painting as a gift, a field of wildflowers under an open sky. Then I packed my bag and drove to the coast. The air near the ocean smelled of salt and sun-warmed wood. I rented a small cottage overlooking the water and spent the weekend sketching, walking, and letting the wind clear whatever lingered. Each night, I watched the horizon fade from gold to blue and thought about how peace often looks nothing like victory, just the absence of hurt. When I returned home, a single voicemail waited on my phone. My father's voice, steady, but softer than I remembered. We got your painting, he said. It's beautiful. Thank you. No more, no less. But it was enough. The months that followed moved gently. I took on new students, held workshops for young artists, and began preparing for another show, a solo one this time. My world had become smaller, but truer, filled with people who saw me as I was, not as someone to fix or compare. On a quiet Thursday evening, as I cleaned brushes and listened to the hum of the city, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. It was a photo of the wildflower painting hanging in their dining room. No caption, just the image. For a long moment, I stared at it. That room, the one where my father once raised his glass and cut me down, now held something I'd made. A piece of color and truth and self. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That night, I walked to the river and sat on the bench I used to visit when everything felt impossible. The water glowed silver under the streetlights, and a warm breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing a guitar, the notes drifting faintly through the air. I thought of my younger self, the girl who had driven away from that house, trembling but determined. I wished I could tell her how it would turn out. That she'd build a life filled with art, friendship, and meaning. That her voice would grow calm and steady. That one day, even the walls that held her pain would hold her peace. The night deepened. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of the river, slow and certain. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for understanding or approval. I had already found both in the quiet company of my own heart. And when I stood to leave, the wind carried the faint scent of rain, soft, familiar, and full of promise for whatever might come next. Morning light filled the studio, gentle and unhurried. The city outside was just waking delivery trucks passing someone walking a dog, below a gull cutting across the pale sky. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and paint, that familiar mix that had come to mean home. I stood barefoot by the window, a mug warming my hands, watching the sunlight trace its way across the floorboards. It had been a full year since the night my father lifted his glass and drew a line through my place at the table. That memory no longer carried the sharpness it once did. Time had softened it into something else, an old scar that no longer hurt, just reminded me where I'd been cut. My life had taken on a quiet rhythm. The gallery kept me busy, and my own studio had expanded into the space next door. Elaine helped me hire 2 interns from the art school, both eager and full of wild ideas. I liked mentoring them, watching them experiment without fear of being told they were dreaming too big. Every Sunday, I met Zoe for brunch at the cafe on the corner. She always ordered the same thing: scrambled eggs, too much hot sauce, and coffee she never finished. We talked about small things, most weeks her work, my latest piece, the neighbor's new dog. But sometimes, when the conversation turned quiet, she'd look at me with that soft smile of hers and say, "You really made it." You know I'd laugh. "I'm still figuring it out." "Maybe that's what making it really means," she'd reply. By late spring, my second solo exhibition opened to a full house. Light Between Walls was the title, a collection of pieces about space and silence, how both could be forms of love. The night was warm, the gallery bright with conversation. My father and mother came early before the crowd grew. I saw them standing together near the largest canvas their reflection caught in the glass frame. When I walked over, they turned unsure how to begin. My father cleared his throat. "Your aunt told us you were showing new work," he said. "We wanted to see it." Eleanor nodded, her expression carefully composed. "You've done well for yourself, Dana." "Thank you," I said. Thomas gestured toward the painting beside us, a vast wash of pale gold and gray. A figure walking down an empty road. "That one," he said quietly. "There's peace in it." I smiled. That's what I was aiming for. We stood together for a few minutes, saying little. The silence wasn't heavy like it used to be. It just was. When they left, my mother pressed a folded note into my hand. Later at home, I opened it. Only one line in her handwriting: "I'm still learning how to see you. But I'm trying." I sat for a long while staring at those words. They weren't everything, but they were something honest. Summer passed in gentle ways. I taught weekend classes at the community center, mostly older adults, rediscovering the joy of painting. Watching them reminded me how art heals, quietly, brushstroke by brushstroke, color by color. Aunt Vivian visited often, sometimes staying a night or two, always arriving with tea and stories about her garden. She said she felt proud of how I'd turned hurt into habitat, and I knew what she meant. In early autumn, I received a package in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. Inside was a photograph of my wildflower painting, now hanging above the mantel in my parents' dining room. Below it, a short note from my father. "We thought the room needed light." I smiled, setting the note beside my coffee mug. The gesture didn't erase the past, but it reached across it like sunlight slipping through an old crack in the wall. As the weather cooled, I found myself walking more. Most evenings, I ended up at the river, where the water caught the colors of sunset in slow ripples. I'd sit on the same bench and watch the city lights flicker on one by one. It had become a ritual of sorts, a place to measure the quiet progress of healing. One night, Zoe joined me. We sat in companionable silence for a long time. The air carried the faint smell of rain and distant wood smoke. "You ever think about moving back?" she asked softly. "Back where? To them. The way it used to be." I watched the water drift by. No, I said, but I think about visiting sometimes on my terms. That's enough, she said. You don't have to go backward to make peace. She was right. A few weeks later, my father called. He said they were hosting Thanksgiving that year and wanted me to stop by just dessert, no pressure. I thought about it for a long time before saying yes. When the day came, I brought a small apple tart from a bakery near my studio. The house looked the same manicured lawn porch light glowing in the dusk. But it felt different walking up the steps this time. I wasn't there to prove anything or to seek permission. I was just a guest one with a choice. Inside the dining room was warm and smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey. Heather and Brian were there talking quietly near the fireplace. My parents moved easily through the room, older now, but softer somehow. On one wall, my wildflower painting still hung above the mantel, its colors glowing under the lamplight. We ate dessert together without tension. Heather asked about my new exhibition, and her tone held none of the sharpness I remembered. My mother refilled everyone's coffee without hovering, and my father nodded approvingly when I mentioned mentoring students. When it was time to leave, my mother hugged me lightly at the door. My father walked me out to the driveway. The night was crisp, the air filled with that faint smell of wood smoke again. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out across the yard. "You found your way," he said, voice low. "That's something." I looked back at him. I think we both did. He smiled faintly, a small human thing, and for once, I believed it. Driving home, the world felt quiet in a way that didn't need explaining. The trees along the road were nearly bare, their branches tracing dark lines against the starlit sky. When I reached my studio, I left the lights off and let the moon pour through the tall windows. My paintings glowed faintly in the silver light, and I thought about how far I'd come from the girl who once sought approval to the woman who built her own peace. I poured a cup of tea and stood before the newest canvas, unfinished colors, soft and warm, a figure walking toward a horizon that was neither day nor night. I didn't know what it would become, but for the first time, I didn't need to. Outside, rain began to fall, slow, steady, gentle. I opened the window and let the cool air in. The scent of wet pavement and distant leaves filled the room. The rain didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like everything had finally come into balance. I thought of all the versions of myself that had existed before the child with paint-stained fingers, the woman silenced at the dinner table, the artist finding her voice in the quiet of an old factory loft. Each one had carried me here. Somewhere between who I'd been and who I was becoming, I'd discovered that peace wasn't given. It was chosen, moment by moment, boundary by boundary. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever had to build peace from pieces, hit the like button, share this story with someone who'll understand, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one. Thank you for listening, and remember, the space you take up in this world was always yours to keep.